Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here to give you a review today of another inexpensive lens from TTArtisan that is surprisingly good. It is an autofocusing 56mm F1.8 lens, and it's the second lens in a series of similar lenses that started with the 35mm F1.8 autofocusing lens that I reviewed a few months back. TTArtisan, when they approached me about this lens, said that they had improved on some of the flaws of the 35mm lens that I had pointed out, with some of those areas including an improved minimum focus distance and thus maximum magnification, reduced vignette, a little bit less chromatic aberrations, and also some reduced flare. Now, this lens I'm reviewing on Fuji X mount. It will be available, at least eventually, on both Sony E mount along with Nikon Z APS-C mounts as well. So 56mm, when you apply it to the 1.5 times crop factor of those cameras, is roughly an 85mm focal length. So a very, very popular focal length for things like portraiture. The price point is going to be roughly $150 US as of the day of this review. It has not been finalized, but that's the ballpark that I've been given. So the question is at a price point of around 150 bucks, is this a lens that's worth checking out? Well, let's find out as we dive into it right after a word from our sponsor.
Today's episode is brought to you by Fantom Wallet, the minimalist modern wallet that is now even better with the new Fantom X that is crafted from aluminum right here in Canada. It is 22% smaller and 35% lighter, while still making it easy to access your cards and money when you need them, thanks to their unique fanning mechanism. You could even customize your wallet due to its modular design, with accessories like a money clip, cash holder, ID display, and even Chipolo and AirTag tracking integration. Visit store.fantomwallet.com to check out their unique sizes, styles, and finishes that span from aluminum to wood to carbon fiber, and use code DUSTIN15 for 15% off when you're ready to check out.
So we'll start by taking a look at the overall build and specifications here. This remains a nicely compact lens. It's an easy fit for these various APS-C cameras. And so in this case, it is 65mm in diameter, or right over 2.5 inches, and it is only 62mm in length, right over 2.4 inches. So it is very similar to the 35mm, except for this lens, as you can see, is just ever so slightly longer. It's about 2mm longer, and as such, it is a little bit heavier as well. It weighs in at 236 grams or 8.3 ounces. A longer focal length at a similarly large aperture means that the glass elements are a little bit larger, which is why the weight is a little bit heavier. Though 236 grams is still very, very easy to pack along. You won't notice that you have it with it. This lens is much nicer in its overall feel, the feel of the materials and the build, than what the price point suggests. There feels like a lot of metals in the construction here. It has an anodized black finish. I really like the little bit of a scallop that is there towards the edge as it approaches the mount, that not only looks nice, but also it is a nice ergonomic place for your fingers to rest as you support the lens. Now, there is no bells and whistles on the outside here. There is no aperture ring. There's no switches of any kind. What we do have is basically just the manual focus ring. Folks, fortunately, that manual focus ring is nicely damped and has a good feel to it. Everything moves nice and focuses well there. Inside, we have 9 aperture blades that do a reasonable job of maintaining a circular shape. Now, included is another one of these quirky lens hoods like we saw on the 35mm lens, in that it when going on, it almost looks like a box for an anamorphic type design. And it is a little bit of an impractical hood in that if you have the hood on, you cannot use filters. This does have filter threads along the front in a common 52mm size, but if you have the hood on, obviously you're not going to be able to put on any of those filters because this needs to bayonet in place and it obscures the filters. So I don't love the hood design. It is a look, and maybe you'll like the look of it, but it's not particularly practical. This design also means that you cannot reverse it for storage, and so for the most part, I just kind of leave it on, and that's the permanent look of the lens itself. Another feature that we have here is a lens cap with a USB-C port built into it. It has electronic contacts, and it's so you can do firmware updates. I do prefer the implementation of the USB-C port in the lens itself, as some other manufacturers do, but it is a nice option, again, at this quite low price, to where at least you can be supported and get firmware updates as things move ahead. Now, one of the things that TTArtisan highlighted that they wanted to improve was the minimum focus distance, and they have done that. Minimum focus distance here is 50 centimeters, so that compares very favorably to the 60 centimeters that was required on the 35mm lens. You combine that with a longer focal length, and we move to a more competitive 0.14 times maximum magnification. By the way, that's about standard with the Fuji and Sigma 56mm lenses, and a little bit better than what you can get from manufacturers like Viltrox or Tokina. And so as a byproduct, it means that even though this doesn't have as large a maximum aperture as, say, the Viltrox 56mm F1.8, in some situations you actually have an opportunity to produce a little bit more bokeh because you can get closer to your subject. So I appreciate the improvement here, and certainly it opens up some additional avenues for the making of images that I appreciate. So overall, what we have here, even if there's not a lot of bells and whistles, it is nicely executed. So how about autofocus? This employs an STM or stepping motor like the 35mm. It is quiet in operation, though if I put it near my ear, I can hear a very light whirring in operation. But fortunately, there isn't a lot of things like clacking of aperture blades and stuff that really adds to the noise. And so in operation, autofocus works nice and quiet. The autofocus speed, as you can see here, is good, but it's not great. There's a little bit of that split-second pause while inertia builds before focus changes take place. And so it is not the fastest autofocusing lens that I've seen, but neither is it slow. It's what I would call about average in its overall operation. Focus accuracy was good, even here on Fuji. I don't always love Fuji's autofocus compared to some of the other brands that I test, but it is getting better, and this lens seems to work just fine in terms of giving me good focus accuracy. IAF seemed to work well, and I got good accuracy for kind of general purpose shots, shots in a church setting, even in portrait type work, and some of these shots taken by my son, who's far from a professional photographer. He took some shots of me as a subject, and autofocus caught my eye every time. Every one of them is accurately focused. So, good marks when it comes to the accuracy. Now, on the video side of things, I found that there was some improvement over what I saw with the 35mm. Focus pulls are reasonably confident, though you can see some minor steps towards the end of the cycle. Unfortunately, that is still fairly common on Fuji, so it may be a little bit better on either Nikon or Sony. I haven't tested those mounts or on those cameras. There is about what I would call an average amount of focus breathing. It's there, but it's not severe. Where I definitely saw an improvement over the 35mm review is that I found that the focus confidence, and when I did my hand test, was much better. And so it's very good in making those transitions from the hand to the eye and vice versa. So to me, there is some growth that I'm seeing already in more confident autofocus. I would still say that this is not necessarily reactive enough for very fast action for either stills or video, but for most people in most situations, I think autofocus is going to get the job done. And so there's some growth there, and overall for the money, this is a nicely executed little package. So finally, let's talk about the image quality. This is an optical design of 10 elements in 9 groups, and while the MTF chart is maybe a little bit more consistent than the 35mm on paper, it doesn't look quite as good. Fortunately, I actually found that my real-world results were better with this lens than what I saw with the 35mm lens, and I think that there's a very specific reason for that. Now, I'm going to give you a quick overview here of optical strengths and weaknesses. If you want the detailed breakdown, you can check that out. That comes at the end of the review, or you can jump ahead in the timestamp in the description. Now, when it comes to real-world performance, I will say this, and that is, I think this is the most impressive results that I've seen from a cheap lens on the 40 megapixel Fujifilm sensor, which is the most demanding thing that I review on at the moment. This is fairly impressive in that this is an entirely usable lens on 40 megapixels in a way that most inexpensive lenses simply are not. So breaking down some of these areas, there is no measurable distortion that I found. There is some vignette, not as much as the 35mm, but I required still about a plus 68 to correct that vignette. So that's a little bit over 2 stops. That's not at all severe, but there is some vignette still there to correct. I did find another area where they were intentionally trying to prove was when it comes to the fringing and particularly the longitudinal chromatic aberration. And it is much improved over what I saw on the 35mm lens, which is, by the way, why I think that real-world results are actually better from this lens. In a vacuum, the MTF chart from the 35 might be better, but in real-world results, contrast is better because it's not being diminished by the fringing that is there. And so fringing is much, much better controlled and it is very good, particularly for an inexpensive lens like this. Likewise, lateral chromatic aberrations near the edge of the frame are minimal, and so very good control of aberrations. Now, when it comes to the sharpness profile, I found that sharpness was pretty consistently good across the frame. It obviously steadily gets a little bit worse as you progress across the frame, so the corners are not fantastic. But at the same time, I did find, moving away from high magnification on my test chart, that real-world results, I was pretty much satisfied with what I saw most of the time. I didn't see a big improvement at f2 or even at f2.8. The big jump comes at f4, and that's when the corners really start to sharpen up better at f5.6 and f8, though they're never quite as sharp as what the center of the frame is. But again, in real-world results, they're sharp enough that I didn't really notice a lingering softness that bothered me. Bokeh quality is good, but not exceptional. And that way it reminds me a lot of the Sigma 56mm F1.4. And that there's nothing that comes across as being bad about the bokeh, but neither is it exceptionally creamy and nice. I think that most people will be happy with it, but neither is it going to produce like magical images that you just love because of the rendering from the lens. Now, when it comes to the flare resistance, it is improved, but it is still an area of weakness. I think that there are fewer flare artifacts, and what's there, in my opinion, is a little bit more artistic. But there is certainly some blooming, there is some various flare artifacts, some flashing that you're going to see. And so there's still room for improvement on the coatings that TTArtisan is using. But at the same time, I think that the flaring here is less objectionable, and that if you compose properly, I think it can be used in a creative or artistic way, and it's less destructive in that sense. But still an area that you need to watch out for. Overall, this is a pretty decent little optical performance for a lens that has such an inexpensive price tag. So in conclusion, I would say this is quite a complete lens at this price of around 150 US dollars. There's certainly better lenses and better lenses at 56mm, but none that are anywhere near this price tag. In fact, this lens undercuts the Viltrox 56mm f1.4, but I would say that it in some ways outperforms it optically. And so I'm quite impressed by what you're getting here for this price. I think that TTArtisan has already shown a significant improvement at mitigating the flaws that I pointed out on the 35mm f1.8 autofocus lens while retaining a lot of its strengths. And my conclusion is that this is, at least to this point, probably the best budget lens that I have used on the 40 megapixel Fuji sensor, one that actually works enough that you're going to be happy to use it there. And that means that it should look even stronger optically on lower resolution models where it's not being pushed to the same kinds of limits. But the very fact that a lens at this price can perform reasonably well on this incredibly demanding sensor is a big win for TTArtisan. If you want more information, you can look in the description. I do have my full text review there. There's also linkage to an image gallery along with some buying links. As always, thanks for watching and have a great day, and let the light in.
We'll start by taking a look at vignette and distortion here. And so you can see, looking on the left, the uncorrected raw image, that there is some obvious vignette, but basically no distortion. So on the left side, we have the manually corrected version. You can see here I've done nothing to correct distortion because there wasn't anything. I've dialed in a plus 68 on the vignette, so a little over 2 stops to correct vignette. Now, what's interesting is that if I click Correct Enable Profile Corrections, I'm not quite sure what the lens designation here, MJ 56mm F1.8 X DA DSM, that doesn't sound right, but what I will say is that it seems to do a perfect job. It's not messing with the distortion, and it is correcting the vignette appropriately. So, bonus. So as noted previously, one of the significant improvements over the 35mm f1.8 is when it comes to longitudinal chromatic aberrations. You can see it's actually really nice and clean both before and after the plane of focus. That means that even in situations like this, I find often that the imprinting on lenses is a trigger point for chromatic aberrations. And you can see very, very neutral here, no issues with that. Here's another one where you can see as we start that transition towards defocus, just a tiny little bit of fringing there up here on this shiny reflective area, the tiniest bit of fringing, but very, very well controlled. So what that means is we actually end up with better than expected kind of micro contrast out of this lens on this 40 megapixel sensor as a byproduct. Because the fringing is so well controlled, it allows the textures to render really nice and crisp. I mean, look at the detail that's there. And so this is a better than expected result, in my opinion. And you can see that even in this very bright area, there's no haloing or fringing around it. So this image really impresses me. One final one here with a lot of reflective surfaces and then specular bokeh highlights. You can see, again, very, very neutral. There's no fringing that you can see in these reflected areas. And you can see that the bokeh itself is very nice and neutral. Now, likewise, with the lateral chromatic aberrations, I can see just the very, very faintest amount here at this very high level of magnification. It's low enough, however, that I actually can't see it in real-world results. So that does translate into slightly better than expected optical performance and better than what I think the MTF charts suggest out in real-world use. Now, for chart testing, here at 200% magnification, this is on the 40 megapixel XH2. You can see that in the center of the frame, looks really, really good. Good detail, good delineation of the various textures. Even in the text here, it's not flawless, but it is very good. And we can see if we scroll up this way that everything is still quite good in the mid frame. And finally, if we pop down to the corners are softer, particularly when it comes to a little bit less contrast, but there actually is still a pretty decent amount of detail there. And the lack of distortion means that there's no stretching of things. That also helps. So while the MTF suggests that the 35mm might have a little bit of an advantage, we can see that in my actual tests, my real-world comparisons, that's just not the case at all. Even in the center of the frame, I find that the 56mm looks better. In the mid-frame, you can see there's better contrast and more detail there. And even into the corners, while there's maybe less of a difference in the corners, I still feel like the lines are cleaner and there's actually more detail in the fine areas that are showing up. And so to me, this is a win all across the frame. I'll also note that at just a more typical 100% magnification, I put the subject right over here in the corner to the area that I wanted to focus because I wanted to see how the corner looked. And frankly, that looks just fine to me. It looks quite good, really, without any kind of serious drop-off. It's not low contrast. I'm really impressed with this performance. Likewise, with this shot at f1.8, I kind of shot from the hip. This dog's walking by, and I thought he was interesting looking, and so I shot quickly as he went by. And as I punched in here and looked at it on the detail level, again, I'm quite pleased with the amount of detail I'm getting. This, like I've said before, this sensor is so incredibly demanding that a lot of lenses look soft on it, and I just don't find that to be the case with this really inexpensive lens. Now, stopping down from f1.8 to f2, there's not any kind of real noticeable improvement, though I do think there is ever so slightly more detail in the text that is there. Still, even if it's a mild improvement, it is a little bit of one, and so that is worth noting. In the corners, not really any kind of improvement there yet. Likewise, I don't see any major corner improvement from f2 to f2.8. Contrast is a little bit better, and obviously the corners are brightening a bit more. If we look over at the other side, about an equal result there and up into the opposite corner. Again, you can see maybe a little bit more of improvement here at f2.8 over f2, but fortunately what we are seeing is a nice centering performance. I would say this upper right corner is maybe the weakest of them. Moving from f2.8 to f4, you can see in the corners there's still only a slight bit further performance improvement. And if we compare the other opposite corner, again, it's about the same there. A little bit more improvement at f5.6. But again, for perspective, here's a real-world landscape shot, and if I punch into 100% magnification pixel level, looking through here, I'm not at all unhappy with the detail. And if I move right off to the edge of the frame, yes, it is a little bit softer here than what it is here, but neither is it mushy. It's still what I would consider usable, and right up here into the corner, it's not pin sharp, but neither is it unacceptable. Now, moving from f8 to f11, you'll see a little bit of softening due to diffraction. It comes really early on this high-resolution body. And that's going to be worse still when you move to the minimum aperture of f16. Now, as noted before, we have a competitive minimum focus distance and maximum magnification for this focal length, and we can see that the up-close performance is just fine. Even at f1.8, detail is holding up, contrast is good. That just makes the lens even more useful. Now, the bokeh quality is, as I said in the summation, it is okay. It's not exceptionally good, but neither is it bad either. It's about average. We can see here that, again, at f1.8, I like what I see as far as the contrast there and the fact that there's no fringing or bleeding off, blooming on the textures. This is a little bit more of a busy background, and you can see that it renders a little bit busier. Now, when you have more specular highlights, again, I'm impressed by the control of aberrations, and so the amount of detail I can get here. And the bokeh highlights, they look good, not amazing, but good. You can see that there is definitely some geometric deformation. Going into a little bit kinder real-world shot where the background's a little bit busier, the detail looks good, the bokeh quality looks a little bit nicer here. Another similar type shot, again, with more space to the background, and you can see that there's maybe a little bit more outlining than what I would like here, so it doesn't have that feeling of being like really, really creamy, but at the same time, it's not objectionable either. So for portrait work, this lens actually works quite well as a budget portrait lens. You can see that the amount of detail there is good. The overall scene and the colors look fine and accurate. Another shot here, and you can see once again, focus, my son was taking these shots, and so he's not necessarily being intentional. So the focus actually picked the far eye. That wouldn't have been my preference. I would have preferred the fore eye to be the one that's in focus, but you can see the amount of detail here is good. Skin textures and colors look good, and as a bonus, you have Nala's tail that's sticking out from behind there. One other thing that I did test just because I saw a clear night, and it's like, well, why not? And so I went out and took a look at the night sky and some astro. So the pluses are, obviously, this is a little bit higher magnification of some of the celestial bodies. Fringing is well controlled with these bright areas, so that's good. As we move towards the edge of the frame, there is some coma. You can see the star points become a little bit more triangular. It's not a terrible performance either, and so, certainly usable if you want a lens to point at the stars. Now, the flare issues have already been documented. They're definitely there. Now, in this case, this is actually a really artistic look. I've added this effect to a lot of images in times past, and so I'm not impartial to that at all, particularly because my detail is holding up nicely there. Images like this, you can see this kind of blooming flare effect. Again, that's a very artistic look. It's a flaw, and I'm not trying to sugarcoat it, but at least is an artistic one. And as you can see with the panning back and forth, there is a variety of effects that you get wide open. And then also, if we look stop down, I prefer a lot of the effects wide open. They're softer. And the good news for that is if you're wanting to shoot portrait type work, I think you can actually use a lot of these artistically. And so again, I'm not necessarily hugely turned off by this because it's an inexpensive lens, but also it adds some character to the lens that can be used creatively. Overall, this is a really, really impressive optical performance for such a demanding platform and such an inexpensive lens.